So speaking of making things more interesting, so December is approaching, and there are a lot of holidays in December. There's one holiday that seems to be overshadowed by other holidays in December, and that's Rizal Day. And I know you've been following Rizal's life. I've watched some of your documentaries.
Yeah, before I myself learned about Rizal as a naturalist, I learned about Rizal through my father. As I mentioned, I grew up in the United States where I didn't study Rizal in school. So I first heard about him from my father, who is also a big Rizal fan. And one of the first stories that he told me was about how Rizal died, about how the Spanish authorities that condemned him to death wanted to shoot him in the back as a traitor. And at the last minute, he used his, I guess, flexibility and training as a fencer to turn around at the last moment to make sure that he was shot in the front, so that when he fell, he would be facing the sky rather than be facing the ground as a traitor. That story never left me. So as I grew older, I just learned more and more about Rizal when I read his novels. And Rizal is one of the main reasons why I'm proud to be a Filipino. Rizal really ushered me into my Filipino identity, and I just never stopped learning about him. So Rizal had always been interested in the natural world, except that his experience in Europe, where he lived for 8 years during his education, limited his exposure to the natural world. But if you read Rinoli and his novels, there are a lot of images there from nature, based on his childhood experiences. He wrote a lot about whatever environment he saw, experienced, and so it's the same with Dapitan. So if you read his letters from Dapitan, it's really a lot of it was about the natural environment, and he was in constant communication with some of the leading scientists in Europe at that time. Of course, Europe then was one of the main centers of learning of science. This is still the age of enlightenment, where there were intellectuals who were promoting the idea that you could figure out things in the world through reason, research, and the scientific method, as opposed to blind obedience to the Pope or superstition or the supernatural, etc. There was this new way of looking at the world, and Rizal was very much a part of it. Rizal was a creature of the product of the age of enlightenment, where science was becoming paramount in terms of people's thinking, logic, and the sovereignty of reason, and all of that. And that's the way he approached his experience in Dapitan. He didn't allow exile or that kind of imprisonment to defeat him. On the contrary, he made Dapitan a place where he was able to operationalize much of what he imagined the Philippine nation could be. When he was in Europe and writing letters and essays and novels, he was imagining our nation, what it could be. Because part of Rizal's motivation in life was to show the white people that brown-skinned people like us could be their people in intellect, in righteousness, in purity of heart and intention and accomplishment. And in the 35 years of his life, I think there's no dispute that Rizal was able to accomplish that. But he was able to accomplish much more. Because when he left Europe in 1892. Sorry, 1891. Yeah, 1891. He went to Hong Kong and then moved back to the Philippines in early 1892 when he was sent into exile mid-1890. He arrived in the Philippines on July 17, 1892. He had already accomplished much of his goals in Europe, and he began a new stage in the Philippines, which was away from all the Enlightenment thinkers of Europe, all these people that he had met and had dinner with and had all these conversations with. Now, the people he was interacting with were rural people, tribal people, Tiruray people, people who were not educated, people for whom, these were people for whom Rizal was a god. Because Rizal came home one of the best trained eye surgeons in the world. Because of course he specialized in ophthalmology, but his super specialization is eye surgery. And in those days, there weren't that many eye surgeons anywhere in the world, much less in Asia, and much less in the Philippines, and much less in Mindanao. So you can imagine, much more than other kinds of doctors, eye surgeons could be perceived as miracle workers. Because this is really a part of his, because he didn't have access to modern pharmaceuticals. So his forest was his laboratory, his area of exploration. It was also where he gathered all kinds of plants and herbs, experimented with them for their medicinal properties. So even back then, he already saw the value of herbal medicine. It wasn't just chemistry produced in laboratories. But he was also
Did you really invent the species that we found?
he didn't do an inventory himself because he was not. That's why he's referred more as a naturalist, which I guess you would associate more with an enthusiast rather than, if you call someone a natural scientist, that person has access to like university laboratories, an intellectual community, you're writing journal articles. That's how you. So we don't want to downgrade this word scientist. Scientists, they do experiments and they advance science. Rizal, I guess, would be like a field researcher in that he collected specimens. And the specimens, many of the specimens, because wala naman siyang kausap doon, he would have to send the specimens to Europe. And it was in Europe where these were identified. So the scientists, Rizal, because of his experience and his reputation, he was corresponding with some of the leading scientists of the time in Europe. Talagang people who are on the cutting edge, like the leading museum curators, leading butterfly experts, the leading seashell experts, the leading taxonomists, the leading Filipinists. Blooming Thrift was like the leading Philippine expert in Europe at that time, etc., etc. So Rizal was in touch with all of these people who knew how to identify these specimens, and he sent a wide variety of specimens to Europe for identification. In fact, some of them were lost because boats would sink, or they were not covered properly, because he didn't have passport. Specimens, etc. You couldn't just put them on paper, fold it, and pagdating dun, gato na, right? So he would send specimens to Europe, often in a roundabout way, through a pharmacist, a German pharmacist based in Manila, who would transfer them to an alcohol container, or would put them in alcohol, so they would last the whole trip until they get to Europe. But sometimes it wasn't shipped properly, it wasn't preserved properly. Not just for knowledge's sake. You needed to know as a doctor what was harmful in the environment. How it's used, etc. Yeah. But there were at least 4 species that were named after him because these scientists in Europe told him that they had never seen these before and they look like new discoveries. So we will name these after you. So there's a flying lizard, tree lizard called the 𝘉𝘪𝘰𝘥𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘬𝘴. And then there is a caped tree frog called the 𝘉𝘪𝘰𝘥𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘬𝘴. And then there is an orange beetle called the handsome beetle. It has spots and is considered a handsome beetle. And the scientific name is 𝘉𝘪𝘰𝘥𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘬𝘴. And then there's another beetle that was also newly discovered called the 𝘉𝘪𝘰𝘥𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘬𝘴.
How do we promote it as something, a legacy of Rizal as the naturalist, so that once you promote it, of course, there's more interest. It's going to be easier for us to trigger to mobilize more support for such a project. How do you think we could be able to promote that legacy? It's also allowing us, because it's also allowing us to reach out to a different group of people.
Oh, absolutely. It's a win-win solution. Well, number one, Rizal Studies is not static. It's constantly growing. Because even in that short life, he produced so much work and wrote so much, and much of it still exists, that there are little tidbits there that have not really been studied and have not really been integrated into Rizal Studies. And as we know, when you talk about Rizal Studies, it's mostly the novels, which are very difficult. And it's mostly about his life as Superman, where he's put on a pedestal and unreachable. Right?
Yeah.
To me, to be able to teach the full portrait of Rizal, to give Filipinos a fuller picture of who our national hero is, basically the founder of our nation, the one who imagined us to be a nation from Batanes to Mindanao. I mean, we were all just a bunch of scattered tribes for a long time. He imagined like 𝘉𝘪𝘰𝘥𝘪𝘷𝘦𝘬𝘴 becoming part of the same nation as the Kalamba Tagalogs, right? Si Rizal nag-imagine nun. And to fully incorporate everything that went into that imagination, we have to include his Dapitan experience as a naturalist, because that's really what his focus on there was. His focus, and that was 4 years. Imagine he only spent 8 years in Europe. That's what basically he was known for. Okay. La solidaridad, no limitangere, el filibusterismo, those are like buzzwords in our history. But Dapitan is hardly known.
But how about in the ASEAN? How do we engage a wider audience for Rizal in the region, given your exposure to other ASEAN countries? Can some of this culture identify with such diversity?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Rizal was a pioneering Asian nationalist. He wasn't just a Filipino nationalist. He was an Asian nationalist. He was among the first Asians, not just Filipinos, to imagine that colonized people in Asia, which includes Indonesians, Malaysians, etc., certain parts of China, could be independent and free, could be sovereign. And he seeded that idea all over Asia. If you read Indonesian history, Indonesian independence fighters, revolutionaries, they knew Rizal. They were reciting the May Ultimo Adios in their language during battle. It's there in the book by John Nery called Revolutionary Spirit. Revolutionary Spirit is about the impact of Rizal on Southeast Asia. It's all there. And it's an erudite book. It's very well researched. So he's not just a Filipino historical figure. He's a Southeast Asian figure for all time. But he's underappreciated. And we need to talk more about him in that context. He always said that when we demand our freedom, we have to show that we deserve it. And we deserve it through achievement. We achieve through our independence movements, through revolution, but also through our intellect, through our vision, through our ideas, through our writing. And Rizal was able to accomplish that for all Southeast Asians. It was not, of course we look at him as our own, but then there was a time when Southeast Asians looked at him as their own, as our own. Because there was no independent Indonesia, there was no independent Malaysia, there was no independent Philippines. There was this brown-skinned Asian guy to the north of us who's propagating these ideas, and he was the most widely respected Asian on the European continent at that time, bar none.